So my presentation is on Persepolis, an autobiography by Marjane Satrapi, or however you pronounce that. We were supposed to have handouts while we did this, but now we're doing online school, so I guess you can't really see my handouts. Um, but the main character is Marjane, since this is an autobiography. It is about her childhood through the story. It depicts her growing up into early adulthood. But growing up, she's very opinionated, intelligent, rebellious especially. But growing up in Iran, she was part of the middle class status, so she had more than most, but she did not have everything. But she knew a lot about Western politics due to the fact that they had a radio, and it'll just talk a lot about Western politics, and because of this, she grew up knowing a lot about the differences in her politics around her and her environment compared to the ones in Iran. Other important characters in the story. There are a good amount of important characters, but the main ones I want to talk about is her mother and her father. They are the main supporting characters throughout the story by being just her parents as she grows up through her childhood. Her father was a photographer, but due to his job, he tended to place himself a lot in danger because he wanted to depict certain images that would show why the government is wrong and why there are issues that need to be fixed. And because of this, he placed himself in very dangerous situations, but in the end, he ended up getting really good pictures. Her mother, though, was known by almost everyone due to something that she did when she was growing up, and because of this, she wanted Marjane to not follow her path, or you could say, in order to help her live a better life and not be recognized by everyone. So her mom just acts like as a supporting character, always there for her when she's in need and all that. Pretty much like her parents, which they are. The antagonists in the story, I couldn't really find a main antagonist, but my idea for the antagonist through the story would be the government mainly, if that would work. Mainly because the government makes teachers teach a certain way and all that. And so for an example of an antagonist, I put her teacher. Her teacher was very strict and would teach them about how to be a proper woman, like what to wear, what to say, and how to act in public. This would change everything a lot since Marjane was very rebellious growing up. She would tend to not follow these rules and stand out even more. But the reason I think this ties into the government is because the government forced them to do a lot of things. For example, wear the hijab a lot, but Marjane really didn't like it, and so on. There are two like main settings that take place throughout the story. The main one would be Tehran, Iran, which is the capital of it. The story tends to take place in the 1980s during the Islamic Revolution, like before, after, and during. But this is a good part of the story where Marjane flies to Indiana and she stays there for a bit. And a lot of the rising actions, like a few of them, tend to take place in this time. But eventually she ends up coming back to Iran due to the issues that I will talk about later. But it's very interesting for sure how she learns a lot about the different changes of environment and how everything is very different. The main plot of the story is her growing up since it's an autobiography. But it's also about the Iranian Revolution. Especially growing up as a rebellious person and disagreeing with the rules and environment she grows up in. For the rising actions, climax, and falling actions, I listed some examples. The rising actions would be like the beginning of the Iranian Revolution, moving to Indiana, Marcus' death, like his death. This happened in Indiana, and being homeless and getting ill. The reason I didn't put some of those in the climax is because the main climax is the Iranian Revolution and Marjane attempting suicide twice. But one thing I also add on to the climax was her grandfather's arrest, since it was very interesting due to the fact that her grandfather knew a lot about Western politics. The following action throughout the story would be Marjane flying back to Iran to move back with her parents after getting ill because she went homeless in Indiana for a while and she ended up getting really sick. For genre debate, I put Persepolis falls under many categories such as a comic, a novel, a graphic novel, a biography, and an autobiographical comic, however you pronounce that. Um, but in the end, I feel like these all are the same, in my opinion. Like a comic is a graphic novel, and then I feel like every book is just a novel since it tells a story. But what makes this really stand out compared to your typical comic is the fact that it's an autobiography. It's a biography about a person and their story growing up. You don't tend to find a lot of stories, or at least comics, about someone's life being depicted as they grow up. For the criteria for inclusion, I put illustrations. Obviously, this falls into the course of a comic since there's many illustrations and it's a story depicted through it. But the illustrations are really well done. They're very artsy, very creative, and very simple. So I feel like most of us can relate to it. It has a very interesting story. It's about a young woman growing up in during a Iranian revolution where most of them are being oppressed, and she personally wants to stand out because she does not agree with her environment, which some of us may relate. We might want to change the environment around us because we just don't like it. Um, another good part, or a good reason for adding it to the inclusion is that it's school appropriate. There's not really a lot of foul language or foul scenes. It's just very simplistic and very straightforward, which is very nice. So Emmerich, you could always teach that. Um, it has a movie to it, which is even better because everyone likes watching movies instead of comics. So we could just do that after. And there's also a second book to it, Persepolis 2, which River should be doing a presentation on. So it also helps the fact that there's a add-on to it in case you want to read and expand more on it throughout the course. Um, Another really good reason I think it should be, added to our curriculum would be because it involves history and culture in different areas of the world. We're specifically talking about like Iran. Like it shows how their politics are very different, how the environment is very different, how it's like very strict compared to the US. And I think it's personally interesting to like learn the different point of views. But the fact that it also involves history, it's just like two in one, you get to learn a bit about the Iranian Revolution through someone's perspective and you get to read a comic at the same time. Um, I said it could relate to students, and I think it can slightly relate to students only because it's about a rebellious kid growing up in a very strict area. There's a review video. You can click on the link and watch it. But yeah, that's what I put for criteria for inclusion. For course timeline, I said if we were to teach this to students during the course, I would say this would be taught after McLeod's understanding of comics and after Asterios Polyp, since we would be able to read it with a better understanding. The reason I say this is because McLeod teaches us about the gutters and how to read a comic in a better way and really understand what it's trying to portray. And then the reason I would say we should teach this after we know this in order, is to get a better grasp of what she is trying to tell us, to get a better grasp of her story and better understand the comic. But then I say after Asterios only because Asterios is a really good book and I personally really like it. But I think it's interesting how it's also a different type of genre than just a typical comic, one can say. Since the main fact is that you could do a lot with it. Like, you could teach a lot about comics, you could learn a lot. Especially, I think it's interesting about the autobiography. And I feel like it would just make sense after these two because that way we could really understand her story and put ourselves in her shoes and relate to the comic in a better way. Understand the time frame as it moves on, since this story does take place in the past to begin with, and this would be the only way to really put ourselves in that time frame to understand how things have changed to where we are now, which is a huge change, especially in the book after you see the Iranian Revolution, due to the fact that it was a major part in history. A lot changed afterwards, and it really impacted, I guess you could say, Iran as a whole, and it still has. And I just think it'd be really interesting to teach it in our school. And then if there's any questions about the book, which I don't know if you guys are going to respond to this, but it doesn't really matter, but there's the slide, I guess. And that's pretty much my presentation.